trouble you for it.
Yeah, and not, you know, send a
Yes. Yes. So,
the stream, so when you walk in the stream, something that they are saying, yeah, get them to see your presentation. So when you walk,
okay. Yes, I'm trying to move on so that I don't have to squeeze past you. Are you going to sort of? Well, you can do whatever you like.
you want to here, right?
It's
Switch on. You can try. You see the red. Off.
hello. Yeah.
It's working.
Right, so here we are. So it is my great pleasure to introduce LCR 2022's first invited speaker, Hilary Nesi. So Hilary Nesi is full professor in English language at Coventry University, and she's a very distinguished researcher. She has authored, co-authored, well over 100 publications, monographs, articles in edited volumes, articles in journals like the Journal of English for Academic Purposes, Applied Linguistics, International Journal of Lexicography, articles in countless handbooks and encyclopedias, and also very recently. And her publications center around many of her research interests, which include, among others, corpora, of course, English for academic purposes, and more particularly academic writing and university lectures, the design and use of dictionaries and other reference tools, ESP, for example, business correspondence. So Hilary has initiated and led a number of very high-profile research projects like BOR and BASE, so the British Academic Written English Corpus and the British Academic Spoken English Corpus. And so she's also a corpus designer. In addition, she's a materials developer and has, for example, worked on a project to produce academic written materials for the British Council's Learn English website. Now, what I find truly remarkable and inspiring about your work, Hilary, is that you always put novice writers, learners, and users at the heart of your considerations, and you really want to, you seem to be going out of your way to help them and to make their lives easier. And so this is like really very inspiring. You also bring joy to linguistic investigation in the way you communicate, but also in some of the topics that you explore, like laughter in university lectures and also aspects of storytelling in university lectures. Now, in your abstract, you write that you hope that your talk will be, and I quote, thought-provoking, and that it will give rise to some lively discussion. Well, I think we're ready to be thought-provoked, and we're ready for some lively discussions. So we're extremely fortunate and happy that you've accepted the organizers' invitation. So thank you very much, Hilary. And the floor is now all yours. But before it is, I will ask you to join me in welcoming Hilary Nesi.
Thanks very much, Sylvie. That was more than required. Thank you. I'd also like to thank Catherine and Eric, particularly because they've been so efficient and enthusiastic and helpful throughout the negotiations about my coming. And hello to all of you. I'm very honoured to be here. I'm aware that many of you have got CVs that beyond my own, and there's many experts here. So I actually don't really regard myself as a learner corpus linguist, although our paths cross many times, and I've worked with many of you, and I've read a lot of the work that you have produced. But I still take a slightly outsider perspective. And so I think maybe that will be interesting for you to hear how I, as someone from slightly outside the field, regard learner corpus linguistics, and some of the things that I find slightly problematic or concerning that you perhaps don't. So this is the outline of my talk, more or less. I'm going to ask you who the learners are in learner corpus research, because that's the thing that puzzles me most, and what kind of text should be included in a learner corpus. Because I see when I read learner corpus linguistics works that different people have different answers to this. And some of the texts that I see included in learner corpus research I wouldn't have thought of as being learner texts. And then a little bit about learner corpus compilation, and a little bit, tentatively, of ideas of how things might, things that you might consider doing in the future. So first of all, I wonder who are the learners in learner corpus linguistics, because I'm not sure. If they're just speakers of another mother tongue, L2 users, well, it's all of us, isn't it, really? All of us are L2 users to some extent, but perhaps we're not all learners. Or is it narrowed right down to attendees of a language learning class? That doesn't seem to be the case in many of the publications I read in learner corpus linguistics. Perhaps it has to be both of these. So I can see in some contexts it is easy to recognize who the learner is. Some of you are working and gathering data in places where there are language learning classes. The people who are taking those language learning classes are much more proficient in their first language than their second language, the one that they're learning. And what they produce has problems. They're not proficient users of their second language. So, okay, so that's quite easy to identify them as learners. But I'm saying, actually, in some contexts, this isn't really even relevant whether they're L2 users or L1 users. And, for example, in the Bohr corpus, which Sylvie says, British Academic Written English Corpus. I asked Sylvie if she'd spell it out. I'm spelling it out anyway. That was a corpus that we produced quite a long time ago now. And we collected writing, proficient writing, from students at universities in Britain. And many people think that they were all L1 users, they were all native speakers. But in fact, they weren't. 1,953 texts are not written by native speakers. They were written by people who claimed that their first language wasn't English. And whether that matters or not, at the time when we were collecting that data, we recorded what their first language was, what they said their first language was. We also recorded how much of their education had been conducted in the UK, their secondary education. So that actually enabled us to identify people who said their first language was English but had not been educated in the UK, and people who said their first language wasn't English but had been educated in the UK. Something that actually MyCusp doesn't do. MyCusp just asks what their first language is. Those of you who are familiar with the MyCusp corpus. And I know that some people have treated the non-L1 component of Bohr as a learner corpus. But actually, you have to be a bit careful about this, because some people who declared their mother tongue as being something else other than English, really, they were only really doing it for sentimental reasons. It wasn't really their first language. For example, we used to get people coming in, a group of people of Pakistani origin or of Punjabi origin, and a group of people come in because we asked them to come in and sign off their assignments that they contributed to us. And we'd say, well, what's your first language? And some of the people in the group would say Urdu, and some people would say English. And I think, well, you know, you're all hanging out together. I guess it's just what you feel. And what they meant was that their parents or maybe their grandparents spoke that language. Don't suppose that they could write anything in that language, but they were still declaring it as their first language. And I was talking to Sylvie about this. I guess it will ring true for a lot of you that you actually write better in your L2 than in your L1. This was true of these people who were of different ethnic origins who lived in Britain and were studying at British universities, but also for international students who, some of them had only arrived in the UK for their postgraduate studies. They were still telling me that they wrote better in their discipline in English than they did in their first language. And this was because they hadn't had much opportunity to write in their first language in their undergraduate studies, because in lots of parts of the world, there's very little writing done at undergraduate level, isn't there? I mean, apart from multiple choice quizzes and maybe short answers and exams, they weren't writing extensively in their first language. So their first opportunity to write anything that was long and involved and required a lot of synthesizing of information and referencing to sources came when they started studying in the medium of English. So they'd say, oh, I can't, I have to revert to English to talk about my subject. So that raises all kinds of questions about whether they were learners or not. And I should note here that although people have used the non-L1 component of BOR as a learner corpus, that was not what we really intended when we compiled it. It has been done very successfully, but you have to be ever so careful, because if you just take all the L1 component of BOR and all the L2 component and compare them, you're missing out on the point that most of the L2 contributions are at postgraduate level, and most of them are centred on certain disciplines. Very few international students come to Britain to study in the humanities, for example. They're mostly in things like business and engineering. So, oh, look, there's a huge difference between L1 and L2. Well, yeah, because there aren't any arts and humanities students in the L2 component, and there are not very many undergraduates in the L2 component. I was just going to make... So, as I said in my abstract, the native speaker designation is increasingly rejected. You are all familiar with this. I edit the Journal of English for Academic Purposes, and we are... in the guide to authors, it advises people against using the term native speaker. They recommend using L2 user instead, but I don't know if it actually helps very much. It's just that native speaker has become a little bit politicized. Native speaker implies a superior communication skills in the mother tongue. Something we know is by no means guaranteed. Doesn't mean that you're a better necessarily a better user of English or any language if you're a native speaker. In fact, we never say sometimes reviewers say things like, get a native speaker to check your English, and we sort of have to remove that bit and say a proficient user of English, because doesn't really work. So we've got some grey areas in learner status. You've got people who are learning another language. In a sense, we're all learning another language as we go along through life. Advanced lifelong learners who are working very well in multiple languages. And there are people who are not learning another language, but it would be good if they did. So... do we exclude these categories? We say, oh, well, neither of these groups are learners, or do we include them both? Similarly, the base corpus was a collection of lectures recorded in British universities. And over the years, I've had many emails saying, could you tell us what the first languages of the lecturers are? And we didn't actually retain that information. I do more or less know it because I know the lecturers, but we never put that information in the metadata because at the time didn't think that it was relevant. You know, they're all, this is what you get. If you go to a British university, this is what you get. Some of the lecturers are not native speakers of English, but that's your experience listening to lectures in a British university. So I didn't think it mattered what their first language was. But we get lots of people, learner corpus researchers, who are interested in that because I suppose they're looking for things that are rather odd about the way they use the language. I would say, well, you know, I don't know whether that's because it's not their first language or for some other idiosyncratic. They're all very idiosyncratic lecturers, aren't they? They've all got their own funny quirks. So, learners can be categorized according to their own sense of being L2 users. So you can go and ask them, are you an L2 user of English or whatever language? Their level of proficiency, you can, in some contexts, of course, if you're working in an environment where you're teaching English as a foreign language, you know what proficiency level your students are. Their roles, are they lecturers, are they writers of research papers, or are they students, or whatever? And their degree of immersion in an L2 environment. Have they been educated in the medium of English, for example? I'm saying English, could be anything. And have they, are they now studying in the medium of English? Because that's going to affect the way that they use their second language. So, for you learner corpus linguists, it may be these questions might be very straightforward. You're working with learners, producing text for a language learning program. But in other contexts, it's not, to say learner doesn't seem to be a very reliable measure in actual fact. So I think outside the classroom, if you're not working with text produced in a language learning classroom, you know, it's often better to think in terms of their expertise. Are they expert users or non-expert users? And culture, it might be so what cultural differences are affecting their use of the language as opposed to their knowledge of the language? And I invite you now to consider, most of you will be familiar with this quotation. Apparently it's very often misquoted, and apparently Bourdieu didn't mean what we take it to mean anyway. He meant something rather different from the way it's quoted nowadays. But academic language is no one's mother tongue, is something that's bandied about. And you're also probably familiar with this argument that's been going on for some years now about whether outside the classroom, for example, when writing research articles, whether it's useful to differentiate between L1 and L2 users. You've got two opponents on this side. You've got Ken Hyland, has written about that it doesn't matter. And you've got John Flowerdew, who says that it does matter. Both of them were working in Hong Kong, where English was the medium of instruction in the universities they were working in, and their students were L2 users. Ken Hyland, because he was an editor of journals, and he wanted to impress on everybody that it doesn't matter what your first language is. You won't be discriminated against as an L2 user if you try to publish in one of the journals that Ken Hyland edited, like Journal English for Academic Purposes and Applied Linguistics. He was very keen to get across that fact. It really doesn't matter. Okay, so you might make a few language errors when you're submitting articles to one of these journals, but if the content's good and it makes sense and it's coherent, then that won't, a few little errors make any difference. So he's saying, arcane conventions of academic discourses are perhaps equally daunted to native speakers who also struggle to produce polished texts. And he's got a point, of course, because actually very, very few people can write. After years and years of teaching, I've come to the conclusion that it doesn't come naturally to many people. When I say write, I mean write beyond an email or a shopping list or a letter to your friends. Most people never get the opportunity to write anything longer than that. And the real challenges of writing an extended piece where you have to synthesize sources and develop an argument over pages and pages, hardly anybody can do that, and hardly anybody needs to do it. We as academics, in our own academic world, we sort of concentrate on that, forgetting perhaps sometimes that most people, that's not what they're learning a language for. They're never going to write a research article, and they don't want to, surprisingly. You know, sort of think, I've often talked to students saying, if you develop this, you could publish it. And nah, I'm not going to. I've got a job lined up. I'm not interested in publishing. What? John Flowerdew, other perspective. Anyone who spent any time learning an L2 will realize immediately that it's more difficult to write in the L2 than in the L1, even after many years of practice and study. So perhaps you're going to side with John Flowerdew on this, you know, as learner corpus linguist. Perhaps your heart is with John. But they both got a point. This many years of practice and study is the expertise, isn't it? And there are very good arguments for comparing expertise rather than L1, L2 status. I'm just going to cite one study, which is old. You're probably familiar with it. There have been many studies of this kind. But Uta Roma, she looked at MyCusp writers, apprentice writers, and she looked at Chalk apprentice writers. The Chalk ones were German speakers. And then she compared their writing to senior scholars' research articles. And at the end of the day, her conclusion was, when we deal with advanced level academic writing, we actually move beyond the native, non-native distinction. In this context, experience or expertise is a more important aspect to consider than nativeness. There is something else here, actually, that maybe she missed, which is that the kind of writing you produce as a student at university is not really the same as the kind of writing that you produce to write research articles. In some cases, it approximates to it in some disciplines, but most of the things that people write at university, including theses, are not the same as research articles and could not be automatically transferred over into being a research article. Even theses, the kind of thing that gets you published with a research article is a really strong argument that your research is valuable and important and groundbreaking. And you don't need to do that as a student. Very often the topic is chosen for you anyway, so you don't need to argue the case for the topic because that's been given you. But even if it wasn't given you, and even if you've selected your own topic, that's not what examiners are looking for. What they're looking for is a recognition of how complex the area is and how many different arguments there are. They're not being looked to persuade. That persuasive element is not there. Also, they're good arguments for comparing cultural background rather than L1, L2 status. So here are a few studies which have compared people writing in English from students writing in English from different English-speaking cultures. UK, US, New Zealand, and again, Loch Ness, UK, US, and Chen was looking at UK, US, and also comparing it to Chinese university learner corpus. Now, all of those found that US writers, students, were significantly more colloquial and interactive than the ones in the UK and New Zealand. They used more first and second person pronouns, more questions, more contractions, very different style, something that is often not considered a sophisticated style, but it was the style that was, you know, expected in their contexts. And Chen said it's difficult to state whether Chinese learners of English over or underuse phrasal verbs because a more striking difference emerges between British and American students. And I did a study some time ago with Neil Matheson and Helen Bersterkman in New Zealand, where we matched up, very carefully matched up, undergraduate literature essays, final year undergraduate literature essays, usually, if not on exactly the same, in some cases exactly the same topic, and if not, on very, very similar topics. And we found a very striking difference between the New Zealand and the American essays. The New Zealand essays, Aula stands for Auckland Academic Writing. Academic Writing in Auckland, it was the Auckland University. And the Aula essays were the most lexically diverse. They had long sentences and words, more nominalizations. They were more phrasally complex and had more conjunctions. All those things that we associate with complex, sophisticated academic writing. And the MyCusp essays were the least. They didn't have a very wide range of lexis. They weren't very complex phraseologically. And they also cited sources a lot less. I mean, some of the MyCusp final year undergraduate essays didn't cite sources at all. I'm a bit nervous here because actually I haven't pursued this topic further because it sort of, I did deliver this talk in New Zealand, but there were some Americans in the audience. They weren't very pleased to hear this. But it's obviously just what's expected in that discourse community. But interestingly, the Boer essays, although they were closer to the Auckland essays, they were kind of in between MyCusp and Auckland. And that, I discovered, was because we'd included L2 writers. They were all native speakers in the Auckland selection, but we had some L2 writers who had studied previously in non-English speaking countries, and they actually made it less like the Auckland essays. If we'd taken them out, it would have been like the Auckland essays. Lots and lots of sources. The Boer corpus was the one that had the most references to sources. Lots and lots of intertextuality. So, differences in advanced level texts may be because of L1, L2 status, or they might be to do with different degrees and expertise, or they might be to do with different community expectations. And it's not necessarily a question of progress through from being an unsophisticated writer who makes a lot of errors and gradually eliminates those errors as they go through their years of study and gradually writes in a more phraseologically complex way and writes longer text, because as they leave their studies and become professionals, a lot of L2 users actually elect, it's a strategic choice to talk and write in a simpler way because they are communicating in English as a lingua franca. And they might actually become less sophisticated in the way they use the language when they're out there in the world, not as academics, but pursuing their jobs in other fields. So, for example, here's an example from a PhD student of mine who collected emails written by business English, because they'd taken degrees in business English, and then they got jobs. Their first jobs were as traders in China. They were Chinese. And they were in a kind of gig economy. They were paid for the number of transactions that they completed. And they made quite a lot of mistakes. But actually, the feeling was that they were being much more effective as traders with the way that they wrote than if they'd used the textbook English they'd learnt when they were a student. This project started with the idea that, we would use the emails that the students produced in their first year after graduating when they got their jobs. We'd have a look at them and we would feed back into the business English syllabus. That's what we thought. But unfortunately, we'd very much doubted whether the business English lecturers would use the texts that we had collected on the trading floor, because they would have said, we can't teach that. That's not standard English. So we collected 86 email chains, and here they are. These are all the people around the world that they were conversing with. And this is the kind of email the students read and reproduced in class. You won't be able to read this, I don't think, so I'll read it for you. So this is a sample. This comes from a textbook that they used. And it says, and it's to someone in Japan, and it's from the senior vice president of some company, imaginary, I imagine, in China, and it says, "We have not received a satisfactory response to the issue raised in our email of 17th of May regarding bills. We are therefore obliged to resign your account effective June 18, 2006. Your payments are due for all unpaid invoices and for all work in progress as of this date. Upon receipt of your payment in full, we will transfer all artwork materials and copy files. We are doing this with much regret. We all liked working with you and are proud of the results you've been getting. I will be pleased to see our paths cross again under better circumstances." Okay, so that was the kind of thing they were learning to write all the way through their business English degree. This is what they actually wrote when they got into the Dear X, this is why. I felt so glad to talk with you at Skype. How's your journey to India? I was on my vocation too for 7 days. He. And I'll be back to work on 8th of May. Last week you said that your design will be okay this week. You can send it to me through email and then I'll give you an answer on 8th. Also, we can talk about it at Skype this Sunday. How do you think about it? I'm looking forward to your reply. Best regards. They were very sweet, these messages. Some of them were a lot of them used text language, and they put things like woohoo and things like that in them. They were dealing with several requests simultaneously, and they were using templates to speed up the process. So things like, I'm looking forward to your reply, presumably they just copied and pasted that straight in to save time, because they were under tremendous time pressure all the time. I just mentioned this because there's an Italian writer, I don't know if any of you know her, who wrote an article called Managing Discourse and Intercultural Business Email Interactions, a case study of British and Italian business transaction. Well, actually, she found that there was misunderstandings, which is what this kind of outcome you'd expect if you were doing a study like this. You'd be hoping, perhaps as a learner corpus researcher, you'd be saying, I'm going to find places where they misunderstood each other, and then I can find out where the errors were and where they went wrong, and then I can teach my students back on my business English course not to make those mistakes. But in actual fact, we couldn't find any cases where there was misunderstanding. They all seemed to understand each other perfectly. And we felt that the fact that they weren't spelling things correctly and that there was often very often problems with tense, that actually was very reassuring for the writers of the other languages, who probably their English was even worse, and therefore they weren't so frightened about corresponding by email. So, learner corpus studies have to take into account all the factors that affect language production, it seems to me. I know some of you, I was looking at the metadata. Those of you, the email went around with the metadata, and I was looking at it. That's something that needs to be taken into account, I think. Time constraints. I think that was taken into account, it's going to make a big difference. With Bohr, we chose not to include timed essays like examination scripts. They're very easy to collect. I'm not saying that it's wrong to collect examination scripts, but then they can't be comparable with the kind of writing that's produced when you're not working under time constraints. Because the purpose of the Bohr corpus was to discover what genres of writing British university students produced, and to sort of chip away at this idea it's all essays. Because although there were more essays than any other type of writing in the Bohr corpus, there are lots of other different types of writing, some of which are clearly oriented towards post-university professional life, so they're mimicking the kind of writing that's produced in professional contexts. That if you just took examination scripts, or if you took examination scripts at all, they haven't got time to produce a proper genre of any description, really, because of the organisational, I don't, when I write, I don't begin at the beginning. I don't know if you do, or if I do begin at the beginning, I can go back later and change it all. Because organisation is everything, isn't it? It's getting things in the right order. And you can't do that in an exam. So time constraints, availability of source text is also very important, because that's going to affect the way people write and the intertextuality. And a very important one is whether the task is directed or open. In other words, was this the outcome? Was the writing an outcome of a language lesson? Because it seems to me that if you spend a lesson teaching conjunctions, let's say, and then at the end you say, and now go away and write me an argumentative essay to bring back next week. Well, lo and behold, it's going to be full of conjunctions because you've just taught it, and they know that's what the teacher is looking for. So if you collect lots of argumentative essays, and they come from different places, and compare them, there's a danger that you go, oh, look, this group used lots of conjunctions. This group are very good at the present perfect. Isn't that perhaps possibly because of what they were learning at that particular point in time? It's a possible influence. And it's problematic, of course, for all of you who are collecting data. And then, very important, of course, the perceived communicative purpose and the requirements of the audience, which I'll talk about a bit now. I'm not even sure that there is such a thing as English for general purposes, actually, because I can't see that anybody writes or speaks ever for general purposes. You've always got some purpose, haven't you? And it seems to me that if you gave me a topic and said, write an essay on this topic, let's say, should children be given homework? I can't do it. I can't write that essay until I've got in my mind, why am I writing this? Who am I writing it for? Who are the audience and how good are they at English? And am I trying to impress them? Am I trying to persuade them? Am I trying to show off my knowledge about all the sociological studies that have been done on homework? What am I trying to do here? Unless I know that, actually I can't write at all. It seems very hard. It seems we're really giving people a hard time when we tell them to write an essay on something without giving them a context. And it seems to me that argumentative essays also give the impression that, above all else, the writer has to persuade. And that, too, seems to me to be something that doesn't very often happen outside the classroom. Certainly, essays in the Bohr corpus, of which there are many, very few of them are overwhelmingly intent on persuading the reader of anything. maybe case studies, proposals and case studies, yeah. But in most cases, in essays certainly, the purpose is to show your awareness of the complexity of the problem and an even-handed discussion of all the varying aspects. The more that you can show the reader that this is problematic, that there isn't a clear answer, the higher your mark will be, quite frankly. And ones that bang on and just sort of browbeat the reader, they're not going to get a good mark at all. And so there's this kind of mismatch, isn't there, between... This might not be the case in other countries. I mean, maybe in the States it's not the same. But certainly getting people to write argumentative essays that are persuasive is probably not very good preparation for writing essays in a British academic context or outside, and I won't be long. So, just one other thought is about if you're comparing learner corpora and non-learner corpora, which sometimes is the case on the grounds that the learner corpora are non-expert and the non-learner corpora are expert. Non-learner corpora usually contain texts which are much longer. Not always, but very often contain texts which are much longer. So if you are getting corpora of equal size, then you're going to have more text in the learner corpus. And that's going to probably affect the range of topics, and that's going to probably affect the lexical range, because there are going to be more different subjects being talked about, and therefore a greater variety of lexis. So it's just something to watch out for. I was just reading something by Pan, who wrote about the dangers of normalized. I'll give the references at the end. The dangers of converting normalized frequency when you're doing cross-corpora comparisons. So, just some further considerations. If you are using BOR and you want to look at the L2 users, match for discipline and level and genre. I've mentioned here a publication by Han and Gardner, where they created a Chinese corpus from within BOR. But the way they did it was to identify all the Chinese contributors to BOR, and then for every one of those assignments, match it with an assignment at the same level, in the same genre, in the same discipline, so that they were doing the same thing. They were, the remit was the same for both the Chinese authors and the L1. That reduced the size of the corpus immensely. It was about however, actually, which is what I think there's going to be a talk about however. So, yeah, so you might know this article, but you're looking at conjunctions, the way Chinese students use conjunctions. If you're looking at research articles, I think it's quite an interesting thing that to find a fail-safe way to establish provenance. You can't do it by just looking at family names or the fact that they're working in a particular country. That didn't really help. It might work in China, but it doesn't work in Europe, does it? And argumentative essays is the same purpose, readership, production conditions. I'm just going to throw this in to disconcert you. I have an out-of-scope letter that are on my files because I modify it a little bit. I've sent it out so because I edit Journal of English for Academic Purposes, and we get many, many very good articles which are beautifully analysed, great data, beautifully analysed. We don't want to publish them, send them elsewhere. And we say, JEEP publishes articles concerned with the use of language for English medium study and scholarly exchange. This does not include the language of text intended primarily for skills assessment rather than the communication of disciplinary or professional concepts. So around the world, of course, there are many places where people can't gather learner data which is a communication of disciplinary or professional concepts, because they're working in parts of the world where there's not English medium instruction, and the only English that people ever write is for language classes, where they're asked to write for general purposes, and it doesn't really matter what the content is. It's just a display. It's just a practice. We don't publish those kind of articles because we're interested in the way people communicate, how they get across their meaning when they're struggling to express ideas. There's nothing to do with skills display, their ideas about a concept. So, directions for, this is very tentative because you are the experts actually here. So I'll just tentatively throw out these possible ideas. I'd like to see greater concentration on texts which communicate meaningfully to specific audiences and acknowledging the close links between texts and their conditions of production and reception. So sort of taking account of under what circumstances were these written and under what circumstances will they be read, by whom, why. Then more studies on the development of meaning making. It seems to me that learner corpus studies have got a great opportunity to look and see how people develop over years of study, for example. So we don't have much opportunity to do that in other areas of corpus linguistics, but in learner corpus studies there certainly is. But comparing learner and expert writing may not be a satisfactory alternative because there are always going to be differences in purpose and content, always, even if a student is asked to write a research article, unless it's actually a research article that they're actually planning to publish. It's not. They've got other agenda, haven't they? They're also thinking about whether they're displaying knowledge for their subject lecturer who's going to mark it and that kind of thing. So it's never going to be quite the same. And more studies of the language used outside academia. There isn't very much on professional writing outside academia. It's so difficult to obtain, isn't it, because of permissions and so on. And bearing in mind, I mean, we take it as read that people are going to produce languages ever more complex. But as I say, it could be that outside academia, they're stopping, they go into reverse because they start communicating on an everyday basis with people whose first language isn't English, and they sort of reduce their proficiency, as it were. Who knows? And that's actually the end, so I did it in time. So thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy I certainly will. I'm looking forward to all these other very expert papers. And these are my references.
Many thanks for this very rich plenary lecture and thought-provoking, as you promised. And so I think now's time for lively discussion. So are there any questions, comments? Sylvia.
Thank you very much, Hilary. This was really thought-provoking, and I'm afraid I'm going to use the word native speaker in my presentation in a minute. But anyway, you have to bear with me. About the question that it's easier to write in your L2 than in your L1. I'm a native speaker of French, and I think altogether I must have written 2 articles in French in my whole career. And what I found difficult was the terminology, but for the rest, I'm certainly, even today, more confident writing in French than in English. Really? So isn't it more a question of all the terms, you know, that you use in linguistics and that I don't know in French at all? I have to look for them, and I don't feel confident. But for the rest, you know, I sometimes hesitate in English. Whilst in French, I think I'm more inventive, more creative, with metaphors and all kinds of things. So I certainly wouldn't agree, you know, judging from my own experience, that it's easier to write in MyL2 than in MyL1. That's all I wanted to say. For me, it's a question of terminology. It's more ESP than English for general purposes, if we can use the term.
Yeah, I'm sure that's the case. That the terminology is a big issue. But I also wonder whether, when you write creatively and metaphorically in French, what would happen if that was translated word to word for word into English? Because there's a lot of studies, aren't there, cultural differences, which things like what is relevant.
Absolutely, that doesn't work, but sometimes that's how it comes to my mind.
Yeah, but I mean, I remember once teaching a student who'd studied in the medium of English and Spanish in South America. She'd been to a university where some of her classes were in Spanish and some of them were in English. And she said the trouble was that when she wrote an assignment in Spanish, when she wrote the assignment in English, she got feedback saying, not relevant, you know, keep to the point, answer the question. This quote from Shakespeare is just a sort of embellishment, it shouldn't be there. And then, so she said, oh, right, okay. So when she wrote her assignment in Spanish, they'd be saying, oh, no, but you ought to show your knowledge, expand, bring in some quotations from, you know, write more and more diversely. So it's a cultural difference, isn't it? I mean, I don't know if that...
Partly, but I think linguistically, I'm still a strong believer in a native speaker, I'm sorry to say.
Yeah, well, John Flowerdew is too. Yeah, no, I take your point, and I think perhaps, I'm sure other people will have other views on that, actually. Is anyone else going to contribute on that?
Thank you very much. This is a very interesting talk, and I do have a comment in relation to this previous comment. So I am a native speaker of Ukrainian and Russian, and I think it might matter how much you use French in in academic discourse generally. So in my case, I hardly ever use Ukrainian or Russian for academic communication with anyone. So for me, not only the terminology would be an issue, even constructing sentences academically that would be appropriate for a paper would be problematic in my native language, because I only communicate with friends, with family, for general purposes, as you might say. So I wonder if you use French for academic purposes in your life as well, then that might make a difference. So in my case, indeed, I would struggle to write a paper in my native language, and it's not just the terminology. Thank you. Sorry, it was just a comment, it wasn't the question.
Right, that's 2 points of view. There's another one there.
I want to add also a point of view. So I think that the current way we are moving around different countries adds to the point that, well, children are born in families where both parents speak one language, so they are kind of schooled in that language, but they are acquiring the language of the community. And what is first language for them? I have 2 daughters. I'm a Russian speaker, a native Russian speaker, and my husband speaks Russian. But children are speaking Swedish and Russian. So which is the first language for them? So it's a kind of an identity question as well. And probably we shouldn't call it the first language Russian, for example, but hereditary. What something that some term like this exists, language. So yeah, I think there is some chaos in this terminology usages. At the same time, I think it is. It puts into perspective what we have been doing for the past 10, 15 years, which means that probably half of our work that we have been doing will be just, if we decide on some other kind of approach to the first language definition, that will throw out of the window part of our work, which we definitely don't want to. So there should be some kind of compromise between what to do and how to define and what to accept. Thank you.
Should we move on to see if there are any questions on any other topic, do you think?
Thanks. I think whenever you look at these kind of considerations that you pointed out about learner corpora and comparability, it's kind of daunting because there's so many things you have to take into account. And then one of the things which you didn't mention directly is opportunity of use. So did the task that they're kind of responding to, did it give them the opportunity to use certain language features?
Yes, absolutely. That's. I should have mentioned that. Yes.
But that's just one that kind of that always comes to mind to me. So it's so daunting. But do you think there are things that can come out anyway, when even if you don't take these things into account, or is this always going to affect everything? Like,
I want to survive this conference. I don't want to. I'm sure it's fine. Everything's fine. I like your point about the opportunity of use, though. But it's true, because just because you write in a certain way doesn't mean that you can't write in another way. Just because you speak in one way doesn't mean that you can't speak in another way. It's what's appropriate for at that particular moment, for that readership, for that purpose. So it's dangerous to assume that just because people don't do something that they can't, isn't it? Yeah.
Okay. So maybe the question didn't come. I guess I agree with the considerations that you brought up. I'm just wondering if you think, just from a linguistic point of view, are there things that anyway we could find that would be unaffected by? We don't have to think, oh well, yeah, but we don't need to worry about, in this case, we don't need to worry about opportunity of use, or because this difference that we found would be valid anyway. Maybe there's no answer. I'm curious.
I'm not sure. I mean, I because I come from an ESP background. This is the reason, and I always tie in language use with discourse community, purpose, audience, and so on. So I'm not sure really. I mean, even errors. Yeah, I mean. At a basic level, people making errors, and we can generalize and say people speaking whose first language is a certain language tend to make this kind of error, although actually often those errors are made across by lots of people in the same error made by lots of people speaking different languages. But and yes, so at a level of error, yeah, it's useful to know. I don't know if we need corpus linguistics for that, because most teachers know very well the kind of errors that their students make. And also, of course, those are the kind of errors that don't matter so much, perhaps, or many of them don't matter so much later on in their. But I don't know. I'm talking myself into a hole here, so I don't. I don't know. Is the answer? I don't know.
Are there any other questions, comments relating to other aspects of Hilary's plenary? Yes, Anishka.
Thank you very much for an interesting talk. I would like to relate to the another issue that you raised is about the genre and about the fact that you wouldn't be able to write an essay on why students shouldn't have homework or should have homework. And somehow our learners are able to write these essays. So wouldn't you agree that there is a special genre, which is a student essay, which is a genre in itself? It doesn't exist in real life outside academia or outside language learning. No. But within language learning, it's a rightful kind of genre.
Yes, yeah, it's I think someone called Wardle called it a mutt genre.
A mutt?
It's a sort of like a mongrel genre. Yeah, it's, yes. Yeah, it certainly does exist, doesn't it? And all around the world, people are being asked to write these kind of argumentative essays. I personally would find it really hard. But they know. I mean, basically, they know what's required. And I suppose in different classes, with different teachers in different parts of the world, more or less emphasis is given on how persuasive they have to be, or their organisational, whether it's a 5-paragraph essay or not. So there will be variations. But those students will know what is. So they already have taken into account the purpose and the readership. But the thing is, of course, that purpose and readership might be slightly different in different contexts, depending on what the teacher has emphasised. I mean, whether or not you go for the 5-paragraph essay, for instance. I don't know, it's just a carrier for practicing language, isn't it? It's just a way of practicing whatever the teacher's been teaching at that particular time. When I teach master students, international master students, and in the first assignment I give them on an MA programme, I say, remember, it's not like an IELTS it's not like an IELTS essay. And they go, oh, some of them are really shocked because they've tried so hard to perfect the IELTS exam essay. I say, it's not a bit like that. It's not remotely like that. Forget everything that you learned about constructing an IELTS essay.
But wouldn't you agree that this is actually a perfect genre for a corpus, in a sense that the students concentrate on the language itself rather than
that's right,
getting the message across, communication? So
yeah, but they're not. But actually, they're not marked on whether.
They're not marked on the content as such,
really, are they? They're marked on how good, whether they're correct, the language is correct, and whether they're using certain features that someone has decided are the right features for IELTS tests, like use of conjunctions, for instance, tick, 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 tick. You can get a higher mark there. You've got to use 5 conjunctions.
Okay, a very last question, and then I'm afraid we have to stop. There at back.
Thank you very much for your engaging talk. Relating to the genre, I think I've got a point to question. When I was collecting data from our L1 Arabic students about their argumentative essays, I couldn't find their voice a lot in the writing. And when I did writing conversation interviews with the same students, asking them, what is your voice? And students said, our teacher instructed us not to, because using I in an argumentative writing, it means we're writing informally. At the same time, when I collected reflective writing samples from different students, I found their voice strongly appearing in the writing. So I think genre plays a very important role in addition to the instructional practices. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree, yeah. I mean, the New Zealand corpus, they didn't use, none of them used I. The Auckland writers, they were very good writers in their final year of literature, and none of them used I, whereas the Americans all used I. So it's what they've been told to do.
Yeah.
And, we get asked a lot, don't we? Can I use I? I mean, it's neither right nor wrong, is it? It's what's expected in that discourse community and what's going to be acceptable to the reader.
You're right, and when I asked them why did you use a lot of I in your reflective writing, they say we were not instructed not to.
Yes, if it's reflective writing, it's very difficult to write reflective writing. Yes. I have a good example of that actually with a colleague of mine, Dilys. She was teaching medical students, and she was teaching them reflective writing. And, of course, doctors find it very, very difficult to write in anything but very highly sort of academic, scientific type writing. So they're completely unused to writing about themselves and their own feelings, but they are required to reflect. So they're rubbish at it generally. And she gave an example of this guy who was reflecting on the fact that he always came late to class. And he'd written in his reflection, punctuality proves to be a problem.
Oh my God.
Okay, I think we have to stop here to be punctual. Thank you very much. So thank you very much, Hilary. Thank you very much for the discussion.
Thank you so much. I don't know whether to leave this up.